The moment my company cut off my access, my coworker smiled. Not openly, just enough to let me know he enjoyed it. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I packed my bag, said, "All right," and walked out like I'd already lost. What nobody knew was that by the time I reached my car, the damage was already done. They just didn't feel it yet. I'm not the kind of person who explodes when something goes wrong. I go quiet. I observe. That's always been my strength. For 3 years, I worked at a mid-sized tech services company. Nothing glamorous, but stable. We handled back-end operations for clients who didn't want surprises. Quiet competence was the job. And that's exactly what I was good at. I wasn't a manager. I wasn't loud in meetings. I didn't dominate Slack threads or jump in with half-baked opinions. What I did do was keep things from breaking. Systems, workflows, deadlines. The boring stuff no one notices until it's gone. Over time, I became the person people tagged when something didn't make sense. Not officially, of course, just informally. "Hey, can you take a look? Quick question. Sorry to bother you." That informal role was the problem. About a year ago, a new guy joined our team. I'll call him Mark. He came in confident, polished, very good at sounding competent. Management loved him immediately. He talked fast, summarized things aggressively, and had a habit of repeating other people's ideas slightly louder. At first, I didn't mind. Every team has one. Then I started noticing something off. In meetings, Mark would volunteer to own initiatives that already existed. Processes I had built quietly over months suddenly became projects he was overseeing. When things worked, he took credit. When something went wrong, he'd shrug and say it was legacy complexity. Guess whose legacy? I told myself it wasn't worth pushing back. I had my job. My performance reviews were fine. I wasn't there to compete for attention. The first real crack came during an all-hands call. A director asked a technical question about a client escalation, something specific, something that required understanding how 3 internal systems talked to each other. Mark jumped in immediately and gave an answer that sounded right but wasn't. I waited. I assumed someone else would correct it. No one did, so I spoke up, calmly. I explained the constraint, the dependency he'd missed, and why his proposed fix wouldn't work without breaking billing reconciliation. There was a pause. Then Mark laughed. Not a friendly laugh. The kind that says, "This guy doesn't get it," he said. "I think you're overthinking it. We don't need to go that deep." The director nodded and moved on. That was the moment I realized something important. Accuracy didn't matter anymore. Confidence did. After that, things shifted quickly. I started getting left out of threads I used to be on. Meetings were rescheduled without me. Access requests I'd normally approve were rerouted. And then came the comments. Small, public, humiliating ones. "Let's not boil the ocean. We'll keep this high level." Once, in front of 2 managers, Mark said, "You worry too much about edge cases." Edge cases were my entire job. Still, I didn't react. I documented dates, messages, decisions. I saved Slack logs. I forwarded emails to my personal archive. Not because I planned revenge, but because something felt unstable, and I've learned to trust that feeling. 2 weeks later, HR called me into a short meeting. Very polite, very vague. They said there had been feedback about my communication style, that I was creating friction, that I should focus on my assigned responsibilities and avoid overstepping. I asked what responsibilities those were exactly. They said it was being clarified. The next morning, I logged in and saw the email first. Access update. Then the error messages. One by one, my permissions were gone. Repos, dashboards, client tooling, everything except email. Mark walked past my desk 10 minutes later. He didn't stop, just slowed down enough to say, "Guess it's simpler this way." I nodded. I thanked him for letting me know. I sent one final email, short, factual, addressed to my manager and HR. No accusations, just confirmation that my access had been revoked and that I would no longer be able to support operational workflows outside my documented scope. Then I shut my laptop. As I walked out, I felt something I didn't expect. Relief. Because for the first time in a long while, none of their problems were mine anymore. And I didn't know it yet, but that decision would cost them everything. The first day after they cut me off was quiet. Too quiet. I woke up early out of habit, checked my phone, and saw nothing. No messages, no emails, no frantic pings asking where something lived or why a report hadn't refreshed. I remember thinking, maybe they actually planned for this. That thought didn't last. By mid-morning, I got the first email from my manager. Polite, carefully worded. He asked if I could quickly clarify where a certain client configuration was documented. I replied with the same tone, that I no longer had access to the systems in question, and that any documentation I'd created lived in the shared workspace I'd been removed from. He thanked me and said they'd figure it out. They didn't. What people didn't understand was how the work was actually divided. On paper, everything looked distributed. In reality, the system survived because I was the connective tissue. I didn't just build processes, I translated between teams that didn't speak the same language. Sales promised things. Ops panicked. Engineering patched. Finance asked questions no one wanted to answer. I sat in the middle and made sure none of those frictions reached the client. Mark never saw that part. He only saw outputs. Around noon, a former teammate texted me from his personal phone. He asked if I was okay. Then carefully, he asked if I remembered how a certain automation handled renewals for a legacy client in Europe. I told him the truth. Yes, I remembered, but I wasn't allowed to touch it anymore. He went quiet for a long time. That afternoon, I started seeing calendar invites get canceled. Meetings with vague titles like sync and alignment. Something was slipping, and they could feel it, but they didn't yet know where the hole was. At 4:17 p.m., Mark finally reached out. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge what he'd said earlier. He just asked if I could hop on for 5 minutes to explain how a certain approval chain worked. I replied in writing that I'd already informed HR and management that I wasn't supporting undocumented workflows without access. I suggested routing the question through my manager. He reacted badly. His next message was longer, sharper. He implied I was being unprofessional, that I was holding information hostage, that this was exactly the behavior HR had concerns about. I didn't respond. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next morning is when things started breaking in visible ways. A client-facing dashboard failed to refresh overnight. Normally, I'd catch that before anyone noticed. A stale token, an expired cert, something small. This time, no one did. The client emailed support. Support escalated to ops. Ops tagged Mark. Mark replied confidently that it was a minor delay. It wasn't, because that dashboard fed into billing. By late morning, finance flagged discrepancies. Numbers didn't line up. Invoices couldn't be finalized without manual overrides. Someone suggested rolling back to the previous configuration. No one knew how. I watched all of this unfold through forwarded screenshots from a friend who was still inside. I didn't intervene. I didn't comment. I just observed. Then came the meeting. I wasn't invited, but I heard about it afterward. Apparently, Mark tried to walk leadership through the system. Whiteboard, confident tone, lots of hand-waving. Halfway through, someone asked a simple question. Why the renewal job didn't retry after failure. That's when the room went quiet. Because the retry logic wasn't in the job. It was in a separate service, one I'd built, one Mark had never touched. They tried to patch around it. A hot fix here. A manual override there. Each fix created another problem. Compliance got involved. A European client flagged a potential SLA breach. Legal asked for timelines and root cause. By 3 p.m., my phone rang. This time it was my manager. No small talk, no politeness. He asked if I could please join a call to help stabilize things. He said leadership would appreciate it. He said this wasn't about blame. I told him I'd be happy to discuss a formal re-engagement through HR with defined scope and restored access. There was a long pause. He said he'd get back to me, and then silence, the kind that means something's gone wrong. By the afternoon, the problem stopped being technical and started being human. Leadership scheduled an emergency call, not a calendar invite this time, just messages flying in every direction. Directors, finance, ops, someone from legal who normally never spoke unless something was already on fire. And suddenly, Mark wasn't talking as much. I know that because he texted me again. This time there was no edge, no confidence, just urgency. He said they might have underestimated how intertwined some of the systems were. He asked if I could at least explain things verbally so they could fix it themselves. He promised it wouldn't take long. I told him I wasn't comfortable doing that without formal approval, not to punish him, but because anything I said could later be framed as me being responsible again. I needed it in writing. That's when his messages changed tone completely. He accused me of sabotaging the company, said I was being petty, said I was trying to teach everyone a lesson. He warned me that refusing to help could have consequences. I took screenshots and saved them with the rest. An hour later, my manager emailed again, this time copying HR. They asked if I'd be willing to come back temporarily as a consultant, short-term, emergency basis. They said they were open to discussing terms. That's when I realized how bad it really was. Because companies don't involve HR unless they're scared of the paper trail, and they don't offer consulting unless they've lost control. While they were scrambling, the damage kept spreading. The European client escalated formally. Their compliance team requested documentation for how billing corrections would be handled retroactively. Finance couldn't answer. Ops couldn't promise timelines. Legal started drafting apology language before anyone even knew what had broken. Inside the company, blame started bouncing. Mark tried to pin it on knowledge silos. He said the systems were overly complex. Someone asked why he'd volunteered to own them if he didn't understand them. No one answered that out loud. Later, I heard that leadership pulled my documentation history. Commit logs, design notes, Slack threads. It was all there. Months of context, decisions, warnings, and quiet fixes. And right next to it, Mark's name, mostly absent. That night, HR finally sent a formal message. They acknowledged that my access had been revoked without a transition plan. They asked if I'd be open to a defined consulting agreement, limited scope, restored system access, fixed hourly rate, and all communication documented. I read it twice. Then I replied, yes, but with conditions. I named the systems I would touch. I excluded anything not explicitly listed. I required written authority and direct reporting lines. And I set a rate high enough that they wouldn't call me unless they had no other option. They agreed within 15 minutes. The next morning, my access was restored, carefully, selectively, and with more respect than I'd ever been given as an employee. I joined the call. No small talk, no apologies, just faces that looked tired and tight. I walked them through the failure chain, not emotionally, clinically. I explained where the retry logic lived, why it was designed that way, and how the recent changes bypassed it. I showed them how one missing handoff had cascaded into billing, compliance, and legal exposure. No one interrupted. Halfway through, Mark tried to jump in and summarize. He got it wrong. I corrected him once, calmly. With evidence on screen, he didn't speak again. By the end of the call, they had a path forward. Rollback, validation, client communication plan. It would take days. It would cost money. But it would stop the bleeding. As the call wrapped up, one of the directors thanked me and said, "We didn't realize how much you were holding together." I nodded, because that night I stopped being the hero. The next few days were strangely calm. Once the fires were contained, everything slowed down. Meetings became quieter. Emails got longer and more careful. People stopped speaking in absolutes. I stayed strictly inside the boundaries of the consulting agreement. No favors, no quick questions, no unofficial help. If it wasn't written, it didn't exist. And for the first time, they followed that rule. Fixing the system took 3 days. Not because it was impossible, but because it had to be done properly this time. Rollbacks were documented. Validation steps were reviewed. Finance signed off before anything touched billing. Legal approved every client-facing message. The work wasn't heroic. It was methodical, boring, expensive. On the second day, HR scheduled a follow-up call with leadership. This one was different. They acknowledged on record that cutting my access without transition had been a mistake. They called it a process failure. They didn't apologize directly, and companies rarely do, but they didn't argue either. They asked what I wanted going forward. I told them the truth. I said I had no interest in returning as an employee. The trust was gone, but I was willing to complete the consulting engagement, help with knowledge transfer, and then step away cleanly. No drama, no threats, just terms. They accepted them immediately. After that, something shifted internally. People started asking why Mark had been allowed to speak for systems he didn't understand, why warnings had been dismissed, why confidence had been mistaken for competence. Those weren't my questions to answer, but they were being asked now. Mark stopped messaging me. A week later, my manager reached out one last time. He thanked me, genuinely this time, and said the company was reevaluating some roles. I didn't ask which ones. The final invoice cleared 2 days later. No pushback, no negotiation, just payment. On my last day of access, I uploaded the remaining documentation, handed off credentials, and logged out. When the screen went dark, I felt nothing dramatic. No victory, no anger, just closure. A month later, I heard through a former coworker that Mark had been moved out of anything client-facing. Officially, it was a realignment. Unofficially, no one trusted him anymore. As for me, I'd already accepted a new role elsewhere. Smaller team, clear ownership, less noise. On my first day, my new manager said something simple. If something feels fragile, tell us early. We'd rather listen than clean up a mess. I smiled and nodded, because they thought I was gone. I wasn't. I just finally stopped holding everything together for people who never noticed, until it broke.